Hey there, my name is Ryan Galloway, and I'm going to talk to you about answering the critique on the water protection topic. And while we're doing this, we'll talk about some critiques specific to the topic, so it will also help you on the negative if you choose to run some critiques. So when you're answering a critique in general, you want to provide four kinds of answers, and they're provided by the acronym STOP. You want to say there's a solvency deficit, you want to run theory, you want to run offense, and you want to run permutations. And you probably want to do it in just about that order. A solvency deficit argues the critique alternative cannot solve your case. So you can argue that criticizing capitalism or anti-blackness will not lead to the specific mechanism of the affirmative that solves for clean water or environmental protections. So if you're running the marine protected affirmative case, you would say criticizing capitalism isn't going to protect the oceans. Criticizing anti-blackness will not protect the oceans, which will lead to human extinction and or the inability to solve for resilience against global warming. I would say that 90% of critique debates come down to whether the alternative can solve the case. So we'll talk about permutations, we'll talk about some theoretical objections to critiques, but in reality, you defend your affirmative. If you defend your affirmative, you'll be in good shape. The next thing you want to do is challenge theory, and the number one theory argument is probably framework, that the debate is a policy-only debate. And I think there are at least two ways you can argue the debate should be about policy only. The first is the resolution is phrased as a policy question. It asks what the United States federal government should do. It doesn't ask what individuals should do. It doesn't ask what our orientation toward politics should be. It asks what should the federal government do. And furthermore, there are an infinite number of critiques, so the app should only have to defend its plan. There are an infinite variety of frameworks. There are an infinite variety of ways to look at the plan, and so the affirmative should only have to defend its plan. In my experience, vague alternatives can also get you somewhere, but I think vague alternatives are best argued as alternative does not solve, because the alternative is vague, movements don't know what to coalesce around, and therefore they are ineffective. Offense. The number one side of offense is to prove your plan solves for the objective of the critique. The plan either helps minorities, tears down capitalism, builds up consciousness to solve these things, etc. And you probably also want to run author indites here. So if you have some Wilderson indites, if you have some Sexton indites, if you have other author-oriented indites, this is a good place to challenge those. The next thing you want to do is you want to run at least two permutations. Argue you can do both the plan and the alternative. And you always, always, always want to permute a critique. The reason why is whatever extra benefits to the critique there are beyond linking to the plan, you want to make sure you capture. So you should say to do the plan and the alternative, and also say to do the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative. So anything that is not a link to the plan, you also do. You can also say do the alternative if the critique alternative would result in the plan. Some people run alternatives that can result in the plan. If that's the case, then there's nothing inconsistent about the plan and the alternative. So here's an example of a critique frontline. You would argue first, the alternative doesn't solve the case. It doesn't save the oceans. It doesn't provide resilience against warming. The next is framework. The debate is about the consequence of the plan. You can argue for fairness, that there are an infinite number of frameworks, and the resolutional question. The resolution asks the question, what should the USFG do? Third is offense. MPAs tear down the bad parts of capitalism. They tear down the exploitation of nature. They tear down the ability to drill for oil. They tear down the ability to overfish, etc. Then you permute the critique by doing the plan and the alternative, and you permute by doing the plan and all non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative. That would give you a rubric, a guideline as to how you argue against the K. Now I'm going to talk about 5 critiques specific to this topic. and talk about the critique of anti-blackness, the critique of the right to water, the critique of anthropocentrism, the capitalism critique, and the climate doomism critique. So here we go. I was somewhat surprised to find that the anti-blackness literature in water policy is better than I thought it was. And the real reason why is because of situations like Flint, Michigan. You're probably familiar with Flint by this point in your understanding of the topic, but Flint, Michigan, the mayor of Flint changed the water supply to a different lake in Michigan that was very polluted, and so people were receiving polluted water, and there were deaths, and there were a lot of damage to people, and the water was super smelly, etc. And there was a study done by the National Resources Defense Council called Watered Down Justice that said water protections are under-enforced in minority areas, that there are a lot of Flints around the country, and that the number one reason why water protections are under-enforced in an area is it's a heavily minority area, that race was the number one factor. So racism is the root cause of inequitable water policy. And until you solve for white supremacy, until you solve for that, then your plan will be useless. And we need to focus on solutions to anti-blackness to solve. Flint was a heavily minority area, and heavily minority areas in the country have their policies under-enforced. To answer this critique, I think you could argue we need equitable water policy, that whatever the plan does to solve for equitable water will make things better in the country. Second, you need government action because of inadequate funding. Individual activism is not going to solve water policy on its own. Individual activists do not have the money to change the situation with water. You also want to permute the critique, say, hey, the plan solves anti-blackness in water policy, and the permutation solves anti-blackness in general. You also want to argue the government has a responsibility for clean water for its citizens. You can incorporate some of the arguments that are in favor of the right to water, and you also want to argue that the plan educates people about the damage to minorities with water policy. What would probably be an affirmative critique, but you need to be prepared to answer, is the critique of the right to water. So some nations around the globe, like South Africa, have said that water is a fundamental human right, and they would say the right is absolute, and that the government owes positive responsibilities to its people. Usually when we think about the United States, we think about negative responsibilities. The government should not infringe your freedom of speech. The government should not infringe on your ability to own a gun. The government should not do illegal search and seizures, etc. But this critique would say the government actually owes positive responsibilities. The government should provide money for water in this situation. The government should guarantee a positive action by the government to make sure that everyone has water. To answer this, you always want to say the right should be viewed in context, that we shouldn't give an absolute right to water because there might be other disadvantages which can outweigh it. Furthermore, the right cannot be enforced, that putting a right on the books doesn't guarantee that the government does anything. The right guarantees nothing. When it's been done in other nations around the globe, it hasn't caused a positive responsibility. It hasn't caused more water. Furthermore, there is a question as to how much water should someone get? People in developed countries use far more water than people in developing nations. And if we guaranteed the same right to water that all developed nations have, then it would undermine the environment, because the environment needs water too. Natural ecosystems need water, and we shouldn't be draining them to provide people the right to water. And the right to water is a palliative. It is a placebo. It would actually undermine progress on other fronts like solving climate change. The critique of anthropocentrism says that water protection should not be human-centered. And in some ways, providing clean drinking water to humans is anthropocentric. It's saying that human beings deserve the right to water more than nature, more than animals, etc. We need a biocentric approach. We need to love nature for what it is, and the plan would only trade off with a true environmental ethic by putting humans at the center and not putting nature at the center. To answer this, you should say we should be pragmatic with the environment, that we're not about to have a mindset shift to where everyone views nature equally as humans. You want to permute the critique, you can do the plan and solve for anthropocentrism. You also want to argue that if you're trying to change the minds of people to get them to protect the environment more, that anthropocentric arguments are more persuasive. Then you can argue that anthropocentrism is morally justified in some measure because you're trying to change human action, and humans are the agent of action in this situation. Then you want to argue the alternative will fail. Most of society is not about to embrace a biocentric view of nature. Most of society is going to be more persuaded by anthropocentric arguments. It is good to protect the environment because it will help humans. The next critique I want to talk about is the capitalism critique. Capitalism is the root cause of water pollution. The reason why there's water pollution is because we are taking profits to the ocean or to water or to streams. We overfish those streams, we pollute those streams because we're trying to make money. Then you argue that capitalism threatens the environment, and we must resist capitalism because capitalism is the root cause of water pollution. To answer this, you can argue that socialist countries have had far worse water pollution, especially in Eastern Europe. During the Cold War, water pollution was terrible. Then you want to argue the world is generally getting better and that capitalism can protect the environment. Even if capitalism has caused some of the problems in the environment now, that we need better technology in order to solve the problem. So you could say, maybe capitalism was part of the reason why global warming is happening, but we've got to have carbon capture technology in order to solve for warming now, and only capitalism provides the profits necessary to uphold technology. And you can also argue that capitalism prevents war. Eric Gartsky has argued that there is a capitalist peace theory and that nations that are capitalist don't go to war with other capitalist nations. And the reason why is war is costly. War hurts profits. War costs billions, if not trillions of dollars. So it doesn't make economic sense to go to war. Finally, I want to talk about the climate doomism critique. It's also called apocalyptic rhetoric sometimes, but Michael Mann of Penn State has recently published a book where he talks about this as climate doomism. He argues that worst case scenarios will demobilize activists. That if you argue that warming will kill everyone, that it makes it seem as if warming is inevitable, and therefore people will not take action to solve warming. And that anxiety does not lead to action, it leads to inaction. It leads to passivity in the face of danger. And instead, we should prevent hopeful visions of climate change and not apocalyptic ones. To answer this, you want to challenge the thesis. You want to argue that fear creates activism, and that the youth movements, like the movements caused by Greta Thunberg around the world, are caused because people think that global warming will kill us. You want to defend anxiety. You want to say anxiety is good and causes activism. You want to permute the critique. You want to say we can combine apocalyptic visions with hopeful visions. And in some ways, the affirmative case is that combination. The advantage contention is the doomsday rhetoric, but the solution provides that hopeful vision. You can also point to historical examples. So the fear of breast cancer has caused an increase in mammograms in the United States. The fear of drunk driving killing people has caused people to drink less. The fear of smoking killing people has led to a decline in smoking in the United States. So there are a lot of examples where fear has caused people to take actions to solve problems. And plus, we should just tell the truth. Climate change is not a pretty thing. We should not sugarcoat climate change. We should tell people the truth and say it is very dangerous. So hopefully this will give you some ability to answer critiques in general, and then some specific answers to critiques on the topic.